When one thinks of Nintendo, they tend to think of a family-friendly company, the Walt Disney Company of the video game industry. The one player pretty openly dedicated to courting and raising the youngest members of the gaming marketplace. They've never really leaned away from that, and have almost always leaned into it, or at the very least maintain that they make timeless experiences for all ages. However, this perception became one of their largest vulnerabilities once they faced determined competition. Sega made the idea stick in the public consciousness through its advertising, and through its own efforts to publish more mature content and allow for looser standards when it came to violence. Sony came along and didn't as much talk the talk of what Sega did, but instead went much further in walking the walk, as its system was quickly defined by more mature and adult concepts for games, such as demolition derbies, sadistic clowns driving deathmatch vehicles, sexy tomb-exploring heroines, and flesh-eating zombies. This last one would prove to be one of the biggest hits in the early life of the PlayStation, when Capcom released Resident Evil in April of 1996, and it went on to be the first PlayStation game to sell 1 million copies, and the best-selling PlayStation game for that calendar year. It was a major viral moment for that console and for the next generation of console games, something that demonstrated how much games had advanced technologically and matured in terms of content, while at the same time debuting something that could be described as a whole new genre, survival horror. Technically, there were some antecedents, particularly the Alone in the Dark series, but Resident Evil was the thing that burst down the door and made survival horror a household name, and helped dig Nintendo's reputational grave among a whole class and age range of gamers. As it became clear, even to the most staunchly conservative elements within Nintendo, that its gamble on groundbreaking, timeless classics like Super Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time would not be enough to overcome the advantage that the PlayStation had in the breadth of its library, they began to make a course correction. They could also look over at their partners at Rare and see that more mature concepts for games like GoldenEye could be major sellers and help keep their system afloat. So, while Nintendo did its best to try and ride out the remainder of the Nintendo 64's life, with some more efforts to get more mature titles on the platform, the technical differences between CDs and cartridges made that very difficult. Famously, it was Resident Evil 2 that made history as one of the most technically advanced porting jobs, as two 650-megabyte CDs were squeezed and compressed to fit down onto a 64-megabyte cartridge, the largest and most expensive Nintendo 64 cartridge ever made and sold, retailing for a whopping $100 US in 1999. By this point, it was a little too late in the game for the Nintendo 64 to reverse its image, and its technology was not necessarily made for it in the first place. Rare continued to show the way with more mature titles like Perfect Dark and Conker's Bad Fur Day, but on the flip side, Nintendo's bread was still being buttered by the infamously cutesy anime-style characters in the Pokemon franchise, which between the Game Boy Color and Nintendo 64 were the main tentpoles keeping their company profitable in the churning period between console generations. With the GameCube, Nintendo was seeking to rectify all the weaknesses it could identify with the N64, not only in terms of its technology, but also in terms of the balance of game content it was offering. Interestingly, this didn't really entail Nintendo themselves changing what they did, what games they made, or how they made them, but instead them recognizing that they would need other companies to make this possible. They started stocking up on partner studios within their own stable, like Rare had been during the N64 era, to make games more mature or simply more suited to Western tastes, like Factor 5, Nintendo Software Technology, Silicon Knights, Retro Studios, and Left Field Productions, which would all join Rare in helping fill these gaps in their offerings. But of course, they also heavily encouraged third-party developers and publishers to come to the GameCube exclusively, or at the very least, to treat it equally with its competitors. While Microsoft was busy throwing around lots of money and newfound industry clout to try and line up every reputable name in game development and publishing, Sony was more or less effortlessly sitting pretty, waiting for them to come kiss the PS2's ring. But Nintendo was in a more desperate position to retain third-party studios. Of course, making the GameCube very friendly to developers and similar to its competition in architecture helped immensely, but they knew they couldn't just get the same games as the other systems. They needed to secure some exclusives in their own corner. While some partnerships, like with Sega, seemed to make a lot of sense from a demographic overlapping point of view, others needed more convincing. Capcom had been a studio that was very much in Nintendo's corner before the Nintendo 64 era, and which drifted pretty heavily towards Sega and Sony afterwards. With Sega out of the game, and the Xbox largely assumed to not be a major player in the Japanese market, it only made sense for them to try working with Nintendo once more. It isn't like they hadn't made any Nintendo 64 games, but like with Namco, they were very few and far between and were really just perfunctory ports of old PlayStation games, stretched to fit within the N64's limits. They had at the tail end of the Nintendo 64's lifespan started showing a new Resident Evil game made exclusively for Nintendo's cartridge-based system called Resident Evil 0, but that had disappeared with the demise of the console. Then, suddenly, towards the end of 2001, Nintendo and Capcom made an announcement that turned a lot of heads, and caused a few of those turning heads to spit out their drinks. Capcom was signing the entire Resident Evil franchise over exclusively to the Nintendo GameCube. There were some asterisks attached. After all, Resident Evil Code Veronica had headlined on the Dreamcast just a year earlier, and was just released some months ago on the PS2. And they reserved the right for some side story games on other platforms, much like the agreement they had had with Sony to keep the mainline Resident Evil games on the PlayStation, which turned Resident Evil 3 from a side story to a mainline title, and renamed Code Veronica to appear as more of a side story, when it was in fact the true successor to Resident Evil 2. The fact that Nintendo now had a deal along these kinds of lines with a major, popular, and very mature franchise was astounding. This was accompanied with the full meeting of the two nations' proverbial public faces, with Shigeru Miyamoto shaking hands with Capcom's Shinji Mikami to seal the deal. Not only would the older but very popular Resident Evil 2 and 3 get direct ports to the GameCube, but so would the first next-generation entry in the series, with Code Veronica's Director's Cut getting its own GameCube port. But also, the Nintendo 64's Resident Evil 0 now reappeared as a GameCube exclusive, and the team was even announced to be working on the next entry in the series, Resident Evil 4, as another GameCube exclusive. The only mainline entry this left out was the first game, which was already 5 years old and pretty aged even by that day's standards. So the team at Capcom decided the best thing to do would be to remake it. This was something they were pretty eager to try, since the GameCube was such a large power leap over the original PlayStation that they thought they could actually realize the original vision for how that game should look and feel. Surprisingly, this tiny team at Capcom, originally just 4 people, decided fairly early in the process that, although Code Veronica had shifted the franchise to fully 3D rendered environments to excellent effect, they would actually stick with the old-fashioned method of generating pre-rendered art backgrounds for the playfield and render super high-quality 3D characters on top of it. They judged early in the development that rendering out what they wanted the scenes to look like would still take up way too much graphical horsepower, as opposed to just having them pre-rendered, but they did make sure that the camera would have much more options for portraying the actions going on screen. Of course, one of the other things that didn't age well, arguably from the moment the original game shipped, was the live-action intro and the low-quality voice acting, which left many players to wonder if it was an intentionally bad homage to B or even C-level horror films.
Hey,
Instead of this, they went back to the drawing board to rewrite the script and have it all re-recorded with new voice actors to try and seriously portray the story behind the game. As opposed to the original live-action intro sequence, they did go with pre-rendering those instead, which had become par for the course on the Resident Evil games that followed the original, so made complete sense. Since we're unavoidably getting into the game itself, let's just jump right in. Somewhat surprisingly for a game that is such a graphical marvel in the system, Resident Evil doesn't support progressive scan output. While this would have taken things up a notch, you can forgive it once you see the game, and once you learn the team turned this project out inside of 14 months. The menus we open with are sparse, with the only thing you'd probably need to look at being the screen brightness adjuster, something worth calibrating for a survival horror game. You get an interesting difficulty choice masquerading as a questionnaire asking you what kind of game you would like to play. Moving past the very high-quality intro movie replicating the live-action sequence from the original game, we get dropped into the famous foyer of the Spencer Mansion, and follow the same plot beats from the original game, albeit in a much more detailed graphical splendor. The discovery of zombies, the disappearance of Captain Wesker, and the search for Chris Redfield. Once you get into full-blown gameplay, veterans of the original game start to find that things are different. Different doors are locked, items aren't where they used to be. There are full-blown new rooms, totally different arrangements on the maps, and totally new traps, puzzles, and enemies abound. Many of the conventions players were used to would remain, such as the tank controls, based on your position to the camera allowing you to move, but this was in many ways a new game. There was the infamous inclusion of Crimson Head zombies, or those zombies that rise from a seemingly dead position after the player had already defeated them once. There is a document you can discover that informs that you need to achieve either a lucky headshot or incinerate the zombies' bodies with kerosene to keep them from rising again. This adds another layer of complexity to the gameplay, as you need to carry around a flask of kerosene and a lighter in your inventory, and need to keep filling that flask from just a few scattered oil tanks in the mansion. But it's something to definitely keep in mind, since those revived zombies are much harder to kill and very fast compared to their lumbering cousins. In many ways, Resident Evil is more a game of time management and puzzles than it is of zombie fighting and action. You make a bet on whether you'll need a particular item, filling up precious inventory slots, and needing to run back and forth across the mansion to retrieve what you need or what you left behind. Gambling on which enemies you should expend your limited ammunition on, how often you should use your limited number of game-saving ink ribbons to save your progress, while also making connections between what you read, what you see, and what you pick up during gameplay to figure out where to take certain items, where to place certain tchotchkes, how many times to hit certain buttons or arrange certain things, and which keys go to which doors. The newer map system in this game does help a good deal, as it color codes rooms before and after you've cleared out every item you can find within them. If you played the original game, you do know maybe half of these puzzles and situations, as this isn't a complete rewrite of everything that took place. But it's exactly what it's billed as: a remake, a refinement, a game that reimagines what the original game could have been, takes its visual style into the next generation, and with a forceful push, more fully realizes what the idea of survival horror could be. Perhaps the biggest part of that is the graphics and sound design, which are some of the finest we've seen on the GameCube, and in this console generation, period. Part of this is kind of cheating, as the original games were doing, since the majority of the environments we're looking at are static, pre-rendered scenes cooked up on much higher-end hardware than the GameCube. But the character models themselves, and anything else given the dedicated 3D rendering of the GameCube, is also phenomenal. The developers chose to use actual models and actors to create the characters, giving them a sense of realism that hadn't been seen before in 2002. Not to say there hadn't been human models for characters before, but this was more often used for motion capture and animation purposes than for actually sculpting the appearance of a person, since the last generation of hardware was not necessarily well known for having particularly detailed human-appearing polygon models. The sound is also phenomenal, as Capcom's Remake group reportedly worked with a Hollywood-level sound studio to create the cacophony of disturbing, concerning, disquieting, and horrific sounds that are meant to put the player on edge. It's a genuine shame and wonder that the game doesn't support surround sound, as that would seem to be a very natural opportunity for a game like Resident Evil. But like with the exclusion of progressive scan support, it does make sense on the condensed timeline of a little over a year this game got to make. When the game was released to the world in early 2002, March in Japan, April in North America, and September in Europe and Australia, it was instantly met with critical acclaim as a new high watermark for video game atmosphere, and set a new standard for what remaking an old title could do for a game. Begrudgingly, those game critics and game players that worshipped at the altar of what was mature had to admit that there was finally a serious reason for them to at least consider adding a GameCube to their lineup of systems. Although for all the sound and fury, this title was only a modest seller for Capcom, with just over 1,350,000 units sold worldwide across the entire lifespan of the GameCube. For comparison's sake, this was in the same sales range as some other major GameCube titles we've seen up to this point, including Pikmin, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, and Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2. It was one of the bigger fish in this pond. The question that Nintendo's newfound partners would need to ask themselves was whether this pond was big enough.